like and subscribe, and leave a comment below. Beyond Antarctica, Chapter 38. Kim awoke to the sound of rhythmic chanting, rubbing the sleep from her eyes. She stretched. With a crack of her neck, she stepped out of her tent, with the strange sounds pulling her toward the guard tower. The rhythmic hum of deep voices teased her ears, eerie and full of grief. Climbing the ladder, she found herself staring out over the terraces, where a dozen or more giants stood hunched, mourning over the bodies of their fallen kin. The giants were carrying the remains of their comrades, taking them down to the base of the mountain in what appeared to be a burial ceremony. Each movement was slow, reverent, and heavy with sorrow. It was as if the entire world was holding its breath for these massive creatures. Kim couldn't help but be struck by the sight. These towering beings, usually so full of cheer, now reduced to mourners. It seemed so human. It hurt to watch. John, who had just exited his tent, spotted Kim at the top of the tower and quickly joined her. His eyes followed her gaze, locking on the somber scene below. "Looks like even giants mourn," John muttered quietly. He watched as the giants carried their dead, humming a deep, resonating chant that seemed to shake the very air around them. Kim nodded, her heart heavy as she leaned on the tower's railing. It's strange, isn't it, to see them like this, so vulnerable. For a moment, they watched in silence. The giants moved with purpose, their chants growing louder as they dug shallow graves for their fallen brothers, using massive stones to mark each one. But then, the peacefulness of the scene shattered. A sudden commotion stirred among the giants. Kim's eyes snapped to the source. One giant, far larger than the others, emerged from the shadows of the mountain. He was clad in makeshift wooden armor, and a crude but formidable metal helmet rested atop his head. In his hand, he held a massive spear, and across his back was strapped a shield that looked as though it had been cobbled together from pieces of scrap metal. John says, "He looks like he is tracking his friends. See, he is investigating the footprints leading out of the woods. He has not spotted the others yet." The other giants recoiled at the sight of him, dropping their tools and fleeing in fear, like animals in the face of a predator. Kim's breath caught in her throat as the armored giant charged and stormed through the graves, prodding the earth with his spear, clearly searching for something as his eyes scanned the landscape. "What's he doing?" Kim whispered, but before John could answer, the giant stood tall, his gaze following the tracks left behind by his fallen brothers. Following the tracks up the mountainside, he knelt, running a hand over the blood-stained ground where the battle had taken place the night before. His face twisted in rage, and then, slowly, he lifted his gaze, locking eyes with John. "Shit," John swore under his breath, his body tensing as he grabbed Kim's arm. "Move, now." Without hesitation, they scrambled down the tower, ducking into a nearby house. The ground shook with each step of the enraged warrior as he made his way to the walls of sanctuary. He peered over the edge, and his face contorted with anger as he took in the sight of the torn remains of his kin, his brothers, now nothing more than scattered bones, barely recognizable beneath the remnants of their armor. He climbed over, kneeling next to his fallen kin. The giant let out a howl of agony, a roar so powerful it rattled the very foundations of sanctuary. He lumbered backwards, sitting on the wall, resting his massive feet on top of one of the makeshift houses as if it were no more than a footstool. Children, terrified by the sight, darted from their hiding spots and bolted toward the main gate, but the giant was quick to spot them. In a heartbeat, he reached down, scooping up a handful of children in his massive palm. Holding them before his face, he sneered. "You will pay for this," he growled. "All of you will pay dearly for what you've done to my brothers." Kim's heart sank. She couldn't stand by and watch. Before John could stop her, she broke free from his grip and dashed out of the house. "No!" she screamed, sprinting toward the giant with the pistol clenched tightly in her hand. "Drop them, or I'll kill you just like I killed your brothers." Her voice wavered, but she kept the weapon steady, pointing it directly at the giant's head. The giant's eyes narrowed, and slowly he lowered the children to the ground, watching Kim with cold curiosity. You're not like the others," he rumbled, lowering himself to one knee to get a closer look at her. His breath was hot, like a gust of foul wind as he spoke. "How is it that I understand your words?" Kim's mind raced. She had to think quickly, raising her bracer. "It's magic," she said, "just like my weapon. I'm a powerful wizard, and you don't want to test me." Kim stepped forward, her eyes blazing with defiance as she squared her shoulders and stood tall. "I used my magic to kill your brothers," she declared, her voice carrying a deadly grit. "And if you don't heed my warning, you'll meet the same fate." Each word spoken as if it was a challenge, daring the giant to test her resolve. The wind picked up around them, adding a menacing edge to her stance, as if the very elements bent to her will. Her heart pounded, but outwardly she was the picture of unshakable power, staring him dead in the eye. The giant threw back his head and laughed, a booming sound that nearly knocked Kim off her feet. "Magic? You lie, little one. You expect me to fall for that. It's clearly some form of advanced technology." Without warning, he reached out, snatching Kim from the ground with ease. His grip was tight but not crushing as he held her up to his face. John and the rest of the crew just arrived, stopping dead in their tracks, watching in horror from the sidelines as the giant dangled Kim like a rag doll. John's heart hammered in his chest. "Put her down," he shouted, but the giant didn't even acknowledge him. Kim, in a desperate move, twisted in the giant's grip and fired her pistol. The bullet struck the giant's nose, piercing it, but he barely flinched. Instead, he flicked Kim's arm with his free hand, sending the gun flying from her grasp. The pistol hit the ground with a dull thud, far out of reach. Bob and the others rushed to John's side, their faces pale as they watched the scene unfold. "How the tables have turned!" the giant sneered, his voice dripping with malice. "For the murder of my brothers, I demand retribution." He lowered Kim gently to the ground and sat back on the wall, crossing his legs and sitting his feet on top of a house, as if settling in for a long stay. "Bring me food and drink, and I'll let you live. If not," he leaned forward with a grin, "I'll feast on all of you." With that, he clapped his hands, the sound echoing through the air like a judge's gavel. "Fetch my food, little ones." Tony reached for the shotgun, but Bob quickly intercepted him, grabbing his wrist. "Whoa, we really don't want to provoke him right now," Bob muttered, his voice low but tense. Then, raising his voice, to the children gathering around them, he barked out, "Bring food, now." A flurry of activity erupted as the children rushed to empty the warehouses, their small hands carrying baskets overflowing with vegetables and fruits. They scurried to the giant's feet, trembling as they placed the offerings down before him. The giant looked down with disdain, with a sneer curling on his lips. With one heavy stomp, he crushed the baskets beneath his foot as the sound of squashed produce filled the air. "What am I supposed to do with this?" he roared, his voice echoing off the walls of sanctuary. "I said bring me food. That means bring me meat, you half-wits." His foot swung out again, kicking the remnants of the fruit and vegetables, sending debris flying. Some of it hit the children, knocking them off their feet as they huddled together in fear. John's eyes locked onto Jackson, who had just emerged from his home, with a look of concern etched across his face. Without hesitation, John signaled to his crew, "Follow me. Jackson, inside. We need to talk," John bellowed. The crew, along with Jackson, hurried inside one of the makeshift houses. The tension in the air was thick as they gathered around a small table, Jackson's hands resting nervously on its edge. "What do we do?" Jackson asked. John exhaled sharply. "There's not much we can do right now. He can see us if we try to evacuate Sanctuary." Jackson's face paled. "So, what then? Are we to be his slaves?" As his hands clenched into fists. "We get him meat." "For now," John nodded. "We don't have a choice. We give him what he wants, stall him until nightfall." A twisted grin spread across Jackson's face. "And then we light the torches." John's eyes darkened. "That's right. But we need to buy time and make sure we have a plan in place. Get your people ready, Jackson. We're going to need meat, fast. Form hunting parties, make spears, and set up traps in the local woods. Whatever we catch, we'll offer him." Jackson nodded, turning to the group. "We need real effort here, people. We have hours at best." He paused. "We'll need to trap prey, and for that, we'll need to get creative." Bob leaned forward. We can rig up some tree-swinging traps. You find 2 trees close enough together, tie a heavy log between them, set a trigger with some bait, and when something comes sniffing around, it swings down and smashes it. Tony chimed in. We can dig some pit traps, too, cover them with foliage, bait the top with meat scraps, line the bottom with wooden spikes. Anything that falls in won't be getting out. Jackson's mind worked quickly as he stood from the table. Let's get a few hundred of the older kids to start building spears. We'll need weapons, real ones. As for the traps, start them at the base of the mountain, in the tree line. John nodded. We head out in an hour. Kim jumped in. Shouldn't we ask the other giants for help? John turned to her. Did you see how fast they ran today? Not to mention how badly they fought. They're no match for him, Kim. They're far too docile, too afraid of him. I fear asking for their help would only get them killed, and then his rage would be turned onto the kids. His eyes softened as he looked at her. We have to handle this ourselves, in a more discreet manner. The group sprang into action. The air was thick with urgency as the oldest of the children gathered in groups, quickly fashioning spears from tree branches and sharpening their tips. Bob and Tony gathered their gear as they prepared to lead the hunting party into the dense woods. The trap builders, mostly older teens, moved with speed, positioning heavy logs and preparing the swinging tree traps along the perimeter. Others worked with makeshift shovels, digging shallow pits to catch any unlucky prey. Others were already heading into the forest, tools in hand, scouting for the perfect places to lay their traps. The forest echoed with the sounds of work, the tension in the air only growing as the morning went on. Kim watched it all unfold. Dad, what if we don't catch anything? She asked quietly, looking at John. He didn't answer at first, just stared out toward the distant forest. We will, he finally said, but the uncertainty in his voice was clear. We could make nets and fish the small river running through the valley, if need be. He knew there wasn't much else they could do. The giant waited, and nightfall would come soon enough. They had no choice but to act and hope for the best. Kim approached her father, her eyes filled with determination. Dad, can I go look for some herbs and plants that might have medical properties? Some of the injured could really use them. John glanced at the woods, then back at her. With a sigh, he handed her the pistol. Just try not to lose it this time and stay where I can see you. Kim smirked, handing him a basket in return. Fine, you hold this. She crouched down, already picking mushrooms at her feet, calling over a few children to aid her. They began gathering the plants she pointed out, filling their baskets with the hope that something might be useful to treat the wounded. Suddenly, a roar echoed from the forest, deep and menacing. John snapped his gaze toward the tree line. He wanted to rush toward the sound, but he couldn't leave Kim behind. The tension hung in the air for a moment before it was broken by Todd stumbling out from the woods, wiping sweat from his brow. Bob just dropped a log on a giant sloth. We need more hands to help butcher it and transport it back, Todd announced. The day dragged on, filled with tense labor as they gathered whatever meat and resources they could. By dusk, they had piled the day's spoils in the center of Sanctuary, the atmosphere thick with anticipation. About time, the giant grunted, with his massive hands scooping up the carcasses. The giant bellowed in satisfaction as he feasted, tearing into the offerings as if he had not eaten in weeks. As the remains vanished, he leaned back against the wall, propping his feet up on a nearby house, with the structure groaning under his weight. Jackson whispered urgently, "It's almost night. A couple more hours, that's all we need to hold out for." But just then, the giant stood, stretching with a lazy grin that sent a ripple of fear through everyone, forcing them to step back. The ground trembled beneath his massive feet as he effortlessly climbed over the wall. "I'll be back in the morning. Have food ready for me," he growled. In a swift motion, he reached down, scooping up a handful of children and grabbing Todd. "And don't even think about running," he warned. "If you do, you'll never see these little ones again," holding his hands up high so all could see who he had captive. Without another word, the giant disappeared down the mountain and into the forest's shadows, leaving the terrified inhabitants of Sanctuary standing alone in an uneasy silence. Kim looked at her father with worry etched into her expression. "Dad, we have to do something. He has Todd." John sighed, lowering his head. Love, what would you have us do? Bob chimed in, crossing his arms. Yeah, Kim, at the moment we need to gather food for the morning, then come up with a plan. Tony frowned. No, I don't like that at all. I say you let me head out, and I'll bring Todd back. John let out a snicker. I'm sure you would, Tony, but we can't risk anyone else at this moment in time. For now, we gather food for morning. Kim, growing frustrated, stepped forward. You people need to do the math. We spent all day hunting, and he ate it all in one sitting. We'll be lucky to get even a portion of that amount tonight, in the dark, where we're the ones in the predator's domain. John winced, rubbing his temples. Damn you, Kim. I hate it when you make sense. There's no way we can keep up with his appetite. He's going to be outraged in the morning over the meager meal we'll have prepared. Unless we somehow come up with a feast, Todd is as good as gone. Tony leaned forward with a sly grin. So I guess my plan to go full Rambo is back on the table. John let out a laugh. No, Tony, we're not at that stage yet. Tony, refusing to back down, urged again. Come on, John. That thing will be easy to track. I'll be back in a few hours. John placed a firm hand on Tony's shoulder. If we don't come up with a better plan, you might get your wish, but let's think this through for a moment. Kim suddenly perked up. Wait, I have an idea, but we still need a feast by morning. She turned and called out to the children who had been helping her gather supplies earlier, giving them quick instructions as they emptied their baskets and rushed out into the woods. Kim looked to John. Meat? We need a lot of meat. Bob glanced at John with a knowing smirk. You still have that fishing gear in your pack? John's eyes lit up. You know I do. But one pole is not going to bring enough in to feed that thing, though, Bob. Bob replied, It will, if we take the line off and use it to make trot lines, as long as you brought extra tackle. John smirked. You know I always do. Bob's excitement grew. Kids, gather some bugs for bait. We'll set trot lines in the river. It's our best chance given the time we have. As night started to set in, the kids Kim sent out to gather supplies had returned early. Fear etched into their young faces. The sounds of predators stalking them had forced them to rush back to the safety of sanctuary. Kim comforts them, letting them know they had gathered more than enough of the essential supplies. 3 hours later, John, growing more concerned, sent Tony, Bob, and a few older children as escorts to retrieve the trot lines. An hour later, they returned with a bounty of fish. Bob pointed to their huge catch as basket after basket of fish are sat down. We got lucky, John. Something huge is lurking in that water. It snapped our last line clean. We barely made it out with our lives. There's no way we can keep doing this with those bigger predators out there. Kim held up a handful of mushrooms from her basket. That's okay. If my plan works, we won't need to feed him past breakfast. John raised an eyebrow. Kim, you know you failed to mention the finer details of your plan earlier. Kim smiled slyly, holding up the mushrooms. These are deadly. If we stuff all the fish with these, when the giant eats them, he'll be poisoning himself, and soon after he will go to sleep, never to wake again. Bob grinned. I like it. It's stealthy. If it doesn't work, he will never know we tried to kill him. We can always gather more food for dinner and keep the charade going. John nodded in agreement. Good point, Bob. Tony, however, wasn't convinced. I don't like it. We're risking Todd's life. What if he doesn't bring him back? What if he doesn't like fish? John placed a firm hand on Tony's shoulder. Give it up, Tony. I'm not letting you go play Rambo. This is our best chance. Kim shouted to the crowd. Stuff the fish with the mushrooms. Quickly, pile them in the center of sanctuary. Her urgency fueled the children's movements as they scrambled to obey. The baskets of poisonous mushrooms were swiftly emptied. Their hands were trembling as they packed the deadly fungus into the fish's bellies. One by one, they dragged the loaded fish to the middle of the compound, the heap growing larger with each passing moment. Bob leaned in close to John. We need a backup plan, John. Just in case. John's eyes scanned the madness around him. There's no time for that, Bob. We have to deal with what's in front of us. Get the kids to make more spears, one for every child. It's all we can do for now. He paused, rubbing his forehead. Later today, we'll work on another plan, something bigger, a ballista inside one of the houses. We can shoot it from a window when he least expects it, but it'll take time." Bob raised his eyebrows in surprise. "A ballista? That's genius. Hidden inside a house, we could catch him off guard, maybe build more than one." John shook his head, a bitter smile crossing his lips. "If only Todd were here to help us. He'd know exactly how to build it." Bob's expression darkened. "Yeah, but it's basic engineering. I should be able to rig something together." He clapped John on the shoulder before heading toward his tent. "Let's just hope we don't need it." As the crew prepared for whatever dawn would bring, John lay down for the night, but soon as he felt the pull of sleep, the booming voice of the watchtower guards jolted him awake. "The giant's back," the guard announced. John shot up, stretching his stiff muscles as he exited his tent, greeted by the anxious faces of his crew. His eyes immediately sought out Kim, who had already rushed to his side. "Kim, stay close to the gate," John ordered. "If things go south, you get the kids and flee into the woods." Kim's eyes widened, but she nodded. "Yes, Father." John's gaze hardened. "I'm serious, Kim. You save the kids. Don't engage the giant. Got it?" Her lips pressed together, holding them firm, but she agreed. Rushing off to gather the children near the gate, John watched her go, his heart tightening in his chest. Turning to Bob, he barked his next order. "Go with her. Keep her safe, Bob. That's my little girl." Bob nodded with a look of determination in his eyes. "You can count on me, John." Without wasting another second, Bob took off to follow Kim. John's attention shifted to Tony. "Tony, you're on the shotgun. Make sure it's loaded with slugs and stay glued to my side." Tony gave a grim smile, sliding in behind John as they made their way toward the giant. The monstrous figure was already sitting, greedily devouring the pile of fish that had been laid out for him. His hands tore into the flesh, his jaws crunching through bone as if it were nothing. John, keeping his distance, was soon joined by Jackson, who looked equally unnerved. "Is everything to your liking?" John called out, trying to keep his voice steady. The giant didn't even look up, his mouth full of fish. "More," he growled. "Double this amount next time." Jackson quickly turned, barking out orders to the kids around him, but the giant's focus was elsewhere now. He reached into a pouch at his side, pulling it open and letting Todd and several other children tumble out onto the ground. John dropped to his knees in front of the giant. "We have many gathering more food for you as we speak. Just a couple more hours, and we'll have another feast ready for you." The giant yawned, his huge mouth stretching wide as he stood, no longer paying attention to John or anyone around him. With a sudden movement, he stepped over the wall of sanctuary, staring up at the sky. His hand reached out, swiping at the air as if trying to grab something. "What is he doing?" Tony muttered under his breath, with his grip tightening on the shotgun. "I have no idea," John replied. The giant spun around, still reaching for something unseen. He staggered back into the compound, dropping to his knees near the tiny houses. His eyes lit up with a strange, feverish gleam. He began lifting roofs, one by one, peering inside before dropping them haphazardly back into place. With a laugh, he reached in and plucked a teenager from one of the homes, shaking them wildly before tossing them over his shoulder like a discarded toy. John cries out, "Damn it, he's not poisoned, he's high." Tony replies, "Looks like he's tripping his balls off." Just then the giant turned, locking eyes with John. "I need a snack, and you two will do," trying to stand, stumbling side to side. John sighed, with his eyes flicking between the giant and Tony. "All right, Tony, now's your chance." "What do you mean?" Tony replied. With a smirk, John said, "Your chance to go full Rambo." Tony didn't need any more encouragement. He dropped to one knee, aiming the shotgun directly at the giant's face. With a deafening bang, the slug hit its mark, and the giant recoiled, grabbing at his eye and roaring in pain. Two more shots rang out, each one hitting the giant's other eye, as he staggered backward, swinging his massive arms wildly. His spear thrashed through the air, toppling houses and sending dust clouds billowing into the sky. Tony, taking his time, fired two more calculated shots, both hitting the giant in the eye sockets. The beast let out one final scream before pulling his shield in front of his face, trying to block the onslaught of slugs. The giant stumbled, tripping over a house before slamming his head into the walls of sanctuary. His metal helmet dented on impact, and with a heavy thud, he collapsed, unconscious. Tony didn't waste a second. "Get vines, now!" he yelled to the children nearby. "We need to secure him before he wakes up." As the kids rushed to follow his orders, John approached. "We can't let him wake up," he said softly. "We need to kill him, not secure him." Jackson stepped up and eyed the unconscious giant with a grim expression. "Yeah, we're going to have to kill this one." Kim came sprinting over, her face flushed with anger. "Tony, you're crazy." Grabbing the shotgun and tossing it to Bob, Tony raised his hands defensively with a half-smirk playing on his lips. "Hey, your father's the one who told me to go full Rambo." Kim shot her father an icy glare, a look that should have shamed her father, but John, looking almost amused by the exchange, shrugged casually. "It worked, didn't it?" Ignoring her father, Kim helped Tony to his feet, checking him over despite his protests. "I'm fine," Tony grumbled, shooing her hands away. "Go check on Todd and the others." Kim cast him a sideways glance, half a scowl, before turning to Todd, who waved from where he stood, still shaking off the encounter. "I'm fine, Kim, but the kids, they're scared." Kim hurried to the children, her voice soft as she gathered them together, herding them to a safer area. Meanwhile, Bob stepped up beside John, the shotgun now slung over his shoulder. "What's the plan, Captain?" John's eyes lingered on the fallen giant, with its chest rising and falling with labored breaths. "At the moment," he said, "we're deciding his fate." The silence was thick, punctuated only by the distant calls of the children Kim had led to safety, and though the giant lay still, there was no doubt in anyone's mind. Their troubles were far from over. This is not goodbye, nor the end. Until the story continues, my friends. B.N.Rocker.